to be on this panel tonight with each of my co-panelists, whose work reflects a deep commitment to justice and whose words and analysis will help to create a powerful framework and lens for our work this weekend. While my attention this evening will be primarily on Islamophobia, I would first like to say that given the particular moment we are in addition to Islamophobia, I believe some of the most pressing issues for JVP's work are to make more visible and to center the Nakba and the right of return, to honor and build with interconnected movements for racial justice, and to continue organizing with groups in Palestine and globally in support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and other principled strategies to achieve justice. I am so pleased that all these issues and more will be seriously addressed these coming few days and have already started to be. Looking from a historical lens at what took place this past summer and since then in Gaza and globally, we've seen a continuation of ongoing dispossession and violence, as well as new realities. As Israeli government brutality has become ever more visible, we have seen more questioning of Israeli actions. We have also seen profound connections being made among different struggles for justice. It's not as if questioning wasn't taking place before this summer, and of course, global movements for justice have deep intersections and roots. But I think there is no doubt, as others have said, that many of us engaged in this movement have been heartened to experience and see new ripples and even crashing waves of resistance in many different corners. We've also seen this summer a further intensification of Islamophobia and how raw and out there it has been. Violence explicitly and interchangeably targeted at South Asian, Muslim, and Arab communities, as well as those perceived to be Arabs or Muslim, has intensified globally as well as in the U.S., where we have seen a proliferation of hate crimes and violence together with relentless anti-Muslim propaganda. So for the rest of my time, I'd like to turn my focus to Islamophobia, examining it within a context of imperialism, the U.S. so-called war on terror, and U.S. and Israeli state violence that both feed and rely on Islamophobia. Let me start by talking about the very carefully orchestrated anti-Muslim propaganda campaign that seeks to equate Islam and Muslims with violence. In our work and organizing, we speak of the importance of resisting and reframing this kind of propaganda. But I do think we need to examine whether there are ways we unwittingly end up taking it in and even perpetuating it. How many of us, in a quiet internal moment, have read something in the paper and wondered for more than a fleeting moment if Islam promotes violence more than other religions? The conflation of violence with Islam and with Muslims is so all-encompassing that I do not think it is far-fetched to suggest that many of us can easily get trapped in a narrative that is rooted in Islamophobic assumptions and propaganda. Religious scholars can provide evidence until they're blue in the face that every religion preaches both violence and peace, and that every religion has those committing acts of violence in its name. But we don't have a propaganda machine that is dedicated to the demonization of Christians or Jews, just to name two religions that are not immune from extreme acts of violence committed in their name. I understand that sometimes conversations about violence perpetrated by Muslims take place with good intentions, trying to show a reason for violence that isn't about Islam as a religion. That is, explaining that the violence is an understandable outgrowth of U.S. or Israeli policy. I don't mean to suggest that this reasoning, this pointing to a larger context, does not have some validity, particularly when it's contextualized for the express purpose of challenging the Islamophobic narrative. However, what I find problematic is that it is still often based on Islamophobic assumption about whose violence is the worst and needs to be explained, which also perpetuates a false narrative about Muslim violence and obfuscates the larger truth that the greatest violence being carried out globally is by the U.S. government and its allies. In my view, if we are thinking about or discussing violence, we should focus on the massive levels of violence perpetrated by the U.S. government and on the violence perpetrated by Israel as an occupying power. This is not to explain why Muslims engage in violence. Rather, it is to recenter the conversation about violence where it belongs. The U.S. has wreaked havoc on and continues to do irreparable damage to countries and societies and peoples across the globe. Further, within the U.S., violence and systemic racism are rooted in policies and practices that made necessary the prison abolition movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the struggles for an end to massive inequality, just to name a few. If we want to have conversations about violence, that's where I would begin. Islamophobic acts, from bigoted subway ads to murders and other acts of violence, take place in the context of the ongoing state-sponsored Islamophobia of the U.S. government, whose foreign policy relies on Islamophobic premises as it is set out to bomb countries with large Muslim populations, and by an Israeli government whose apartheid policies interact with and are buttressed by its equation of Islam with evil. Human rights lawyer and activist Dina Ahmed has written, quote, Islamophobia necessitates convincing people that there's a war at home and abroad, and that this messaging pushes through a brutal agenda and also allows our government to mask its true agenda, unquote. In its war on Muslims abroad, Islamophobia at home becomes amplified, and intentionally so. The goal is to turn the focus on violence of Muslims rather than on the pervasive violence of imperialism and occupation. Yeah. Professor and activist Deepak Kumar, author of Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire, has written about the centrality of empire in fostering and sustaining Islamophobia. She has written, quote, at its core, liberal Islamophobia flows from the logic of liberal imperialism. As several scholars have argued, liberal imperialism is based on using liberal ideas to justify empire and spans the gamut from the narrative about rescuing women and children from brutal dictators to fostering democracy. Liberal Islamophobia flows from this logic. Therefore, Islamophobia, U.S. imperialism, and the war on terror must be understood to be inseparable and an integral part of our analysis and organizing for justice in Palestine and worldwide. While Islamophobia has a long and ugly history beginning way before 9/11, I am making the assumption that for many of us from outside the Muslim community, our activism and awareness about what Islamophobia is and how it manifests itself is relatively recent. For me, it was my involvement several years ago with a Muslim principal of an Arabic dual-language public school who lost her position because of a sustained Islamophobic campaign directly related to Israel politics that brought this issue to my attention. I had never seen or understood the many dimensions of that Islamophobia so starkly as I did with this campaign. And while the rabid Islamophobes did their damage, the real damage was done by the mayor of New York City and the Department of Education, government institutions that capitulated to the demands of the Islamophobes who demanded the principal's resignation. So too, it is the Islamophobes who have stirred up fears of Muslim violence in New York City. But it was New York City's mayor who endorsed police surveillance of the city's entire Muslim community. One of the reasons I think Islamophobia has not been a burning issue for many of us is because we haven't integrated it deeply into our analysis or into our hearts and souls. I'd like to make a call for that tonight. I think the reality warrants it. I believe that in our work for justice in Palestine, we need to think about where and how Islamophobia intersects and penetrates at every level, and to understand how both Israel and the U.S. foment and rely on Islamophobia for their ongoing acts of violence. And of course, to understand the way that Islamophobia and racism are interlinked is critical to our work. I do think that those who live and experience Islamophobia and other forms of racism and bigotry daily understand the intersections clearly, as we see from the organizing going on, and it has been described this evening. These intersections and connections are being made not to create sameness, but to strengthen the distinct yet overlapping struggles for justice. Finally, How do those of us who are part of JDP interact with this work? Where do we enter? What is the right way to do it? I know we will be thinking about how to make our organizing as meaningful as possible throughout the weekend in relation to all our work. Clearly and significantly, Islamophobia is going to be challenged by those most impacted by its injustices, and there is enormous organizing going on within Muslim communities. I believe our role as members of JDP is to continue to speak out as Jews opposed to Islamophobia, to continue our work to expose the underlying issues and links related to Islamophobia and the politics of both Israel and the U.S., to pay close attention and meaningfully engage with those who are living and experiencing racism and Islamophobia, and to be principled, consistent partners in this work. In the event that any of this sounds like I'm talking to you and not to me, please let me be clear that these are the kinds of questions I challenge myself about as I try to think about how to engage with this work as genuinely as possible. Thank you.